From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors these broadcasts, and I'm delighted to have as our guest for this broadcast a man who I've known for more than 50 years, or about 50 years, which shows how old he is, and I guess I am too. His name is David Franke. Dave was one of the founders and architects of the conservative movement. His first main project was head of the National Student Committee for the Loyalty Oath, which basically said if people are, correct me if I'm wrong, if people are getting government money or teaching in privileged institutions, they should pledge allegiance to the United States of America. Is that basically it?
That's basically it. The liberals at that time were saying, we want to accept the federal money, which was not as usual then as now, but they didn't want to take the oath that the ROTC had to take.
And by the way, right now we're in the midst of a Supreme Court fight in which the former dean of the Harvard Law School is coming under great criticism for the fact that she denied the U.S. military the opportunity to recruit people for ROTC at Harvard Law because of the military's policy on don't ask, don't tell on homosexuals. And when this show is aired, we'll know whether or not she's been nominated despite that fact, but that was something that inhibited her progress. Well, what are some of the other things you did in the early days of the movement?
I was in the very first human events journalism class under Stan Evans.
I attended not the class, but human events conferences. I remember when Stan, a very great man, was the editor of the Yale Daily News.
Right.
And then at the age of 23, he was the editor of the Indianapolis News.
Youngest metropolitan newspaper editor in the country, yeah.
A brilliant man, a tremendous conservative, a great writer. He's written some historically memorable books, and we've all been privileged to know him.
One of the funniest conservatives around.
Yes, he is.
To this day.
He has a tremendous sense of humor. Well, tell me what else you did.
Then I went up to New York, and I was editorial assistant to Bill Buckley, and it was during that time that we started Young Americans for Freedom.
Yes,
and
I was at the founding conference in 1960. As a matter of fact, I provided the name Young Americans for Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
There was debate about whether it should be called the National Association of the Advancement of Conservative People, but someone else had those initials. So we decided on Young Americans for Freedom. But I remember we met in Sharon, Connecticut.
Right.
That was in 1960. And
you were at Harvard then, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, it was my great honor to be one of the main speakers at the 5th anniversary dinner of National Review, and they picked me not because of my personal qualities, but because I had the title President of the Harvard Student Council.
Right.
And that was a great experience for me. And Bill Buckley sent me a wonderful letter, which I have framed on my wall. You know, that was a great event. Well, what else?
Well, it was all over the lot in those early years. I was the Washington correspondent for National Review for a time. I was, for a long time, senior editor at Arlington House Conservative Book Club, back in the original formulation when they were started and run by Neil McCaffrey.
I remember.
And I started the book program for Liberty Fund, a foundation in Indianapolis.
They've produced some terrific works.
Yeah, we had two imprints that I started, Liberty Press for current books, Liberty Classics for the other.
I've purchased many of their publications. It's great stuff.
You know who my number one individual customer was?
Jim McClellan?
Nope.
No, who?
John Wayne.
You're kidding.
No.
Is that right?
And
too bad he was wrong on the Panama Canal.
I'm not sure how many of them he read.
Yeah.
But but he thought they were so beautiful and such great conservative titles that he gave them en masse as Christmas presents to his friends.
Wonderful.
And
isn't that great?
Yeah, I've got it. I've got the copy of the check somewhere in all of my stuff.
That's great. Then what?
Phillips Publishing for a long time, where
When it was still Pink Sheet on the left, or
oh, yeah, it was still going then. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it had changed, but I wasn't involved in that. Started in the financial newsletters, and then in the health newsletters, where I started the whole alternative health program.
Tom Phillips has made a fortune on that.
Yeah, and after that, 2 or 3 years as editor of the writer and editor of the John Nesbitt Trend Letter, which was one of the most fun things I've done.
I met John Nesbitt at a money conference a couple of decades ago.
Yeah,
brilliant guy.
I never met him, but
you're kidding.
I would just write it in Washington. We were in Georgetown, and whenever he had a fight with the publisher, he would say, "I don't approve of the copy." And I knew it had nothing to do with the copy. It was just a fight between him and the publisher. And then I left there. I spent the last decade working with Richard Viguerie, and now I've known Richard, as
you were his roommate in Greenwich Village.
That's right. And so I've actually known him a couple of years longer than
I was
you.
one of Richard's arch enemies back in the early 60s.
At one point, we were all enemies of each other.
And I expended a great deal of energy opposing his selection as executive director of Young Americans for Freedom, which was being pushed by Bill Rusher. What books did you work on with Richard?
The main one was America's Right Turn, and that detailed how conservatives got around the liberal domination of the news media by creating the alternative media. And that included direct mail, which Richard was the one who started that, of course, political direct mail, and now is used by everyone in politics, and went on to discuss how conservatives then got into talk radio, cable TV, and so forth. Now the internet.
Now you've put out some books under your own name, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
About a dozen of them.
Yeah.
And what is your most recent book?
The one under my own name, I couldn't even tell you so long ago. Okay. But I'm back to writing books now again.
What currently is your topic?
I'm writing about. Well, I'm at that age where I'm trying to make sense of everything that's happened during my lifetime.
That's the topic of this program.
Yes, right. So generally speaking, it's the failure of liberalism, the failure of conservatism, and the triumph of fascism. And,
well, in the first part of this show, talk to us about the failure of liberalism, and then we'll do the failure of conservatism in the next segment.
Okay. Well, the liberalism, classical liberalism, was part of our foundation as conservatives here. It was built on private property, rule of law, encouraging private business enterprise, and parliamentary government.
Still pretty good stuff.
Yeah, and it was always more successful in the English-speaking countries, England and the United States.
Why do you suppose that was?
I don't know. I mean, I think having a history of constitutions was not the cause of it, but an example of it. It was. I'm not that good at that history to say why it happened more in England and the U.S. than on the continent. But there were flourishing movements in Germany and France, the two main countries on the continent. So it's not that it wasn't there; it just wasn't as successful. And so during the time between World War I and World War II, that was the period when liberalism changed. Basically, by the time World War II came around, it was extinguished in Europe, continental Europe, and continental Europe was then up for grabs between the socialists and the communists. In England, the Fabian Society had infiltrated the universities, the media, everything, and they believed that you couldn't have in England, because of the tradition of law and everything, you couldn't have outright socialism. So they did piecemeal socialism. And
it shows that conspiracies can work.
Oh yeah. And as Stan Evans, I keep after him to finish the book he told me about 50 years ago that he was working on. The conspiracy theory of history, which turned on the liberal had the conspiracy theory of history, which they poo-pooed. History can be seen as a whole litany of conspiracies.
That's right.
And so that worked in England to change liberalism completely around. In the U.S., the same thing happened, and it was basically intellectuals and journalists and others around the New Republic magazine and the foundations and so forth. And so by World War II...
Why was the New Republic so influential?
Well, because it was the foremost liberal publication in the United States. Under the old definition...
Was it Godkin who was the head of it?
Yeah, there were several very, very prominent editors at the time. But because they were so influential at the time as classical liberals, when they changed, they sort of changed the whole movement along with it. And so by the time World War II came around, liberalism had basically, from the standpoint of what it originally stood for, had failed.
We have to take a break. When we come back, we'll switch gears and talk about the failure of conservatism. Please stay with us. I'm Howard Phillips. Our guest is David Franke, and I think you're going to enjoy this discussion. We'll be right back.
You are a defender of liberty. You spoke out.
That is part of your job.
You were heard in Congress.
No.
You marched. You created a new movement. You endured attacks.
You see folks waving tea bags around.
Now you can help to
Repeal the bill.
go to sendthematmessage.com. Print the pledge to repeal Obamacare. Send it to your representative, senators, and candidates to sign that they pledge to
Repeal the bill! Repeal the bill!
Repeal the bill. Repeal the bill.
Repeal the bill.
Repeal the bill. Repeal the bill. Repeal the bill.
Repeal the bill! Now!
Go to sendthematmessage.com and help.
Repeal the bill.
Hey, listen. This is the greatest thing. I want to tell you something. Something's happening in this country. And I want to tell you, look around my friends here. My friends here in Washington, come over here. See all these great people? These great folks are here because they want to take the country back to the direction of the Founding Fathers and stop all this nonsense that's going on and stop this, this immersion into socialism, which is happening. We've got to stop it. And every day we're losing a little bit of our freedom. But the answer is that the individual citizens can make a difference. They can walk through these houses of Congress. They can look their congressman in the eye and say, hey, vote this bill down. Get rid of it. We got a lot of work to do. And the first thing we have to do is get rid of the garbage and the attacks on our freedoms. This is it. So anyway, that's what these guys are doing here today to do. Yes! And I say, all of you guys out there, with the sound of my voice and the visual that this great gentleman has created, get down here and do your responsible citizenship by going and seeing your representatives and telling them, what you want, because this is your house. It's not their house. Get in there and tell them what to do, and let's begin cleaning this country up. A big mess has been created in only a year's time, in 9 months' time, really. A big mess we have to recover from. We got to start work. We got to throw some people out. So anyway, I love this country. I love you. Go do your job. Thank you for your help. Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable, and we have as our guest David Franke, a veteran leader of the conservative movement, who in the first portion of this program told us about the failure of liberalism in recent decades. And now the sad part of the program comes. He's going to tell us about the failure of conservatism. David, it's all yours.
Well, I have a very simple test on what we tried to do domestically. Take the domestic side first. It was to decrease the size of the government, eliminate whole departments, and so forth.
Even Reagan increased the size of government.
Yeah. And it's been a solid failure. There hasn't been one, since we started the conservative movement in the late 50s and early 60s, there hasn't been one decrease in government spending. There have been some years that are better than others, but it's always the amount of increase in the government's size of the government, the intrusiveness of the government, the violations of the Constitution, all of these things. And I don't see how we can take any position to accept that conservative movement has been a failure on that regard.
Let me just give you a personal anecdote. There was a battle between John Silber, the head of Boston University, and Bill Bennett, the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, as to who would be Secretary of Education under Reagan. Bennett came to me, and at that point I had the action on that issue, having succeeded in getting Ed Meese to fire Terrell Bell, who had been funding the National Education Association. And Bill said, I'd like your support for me to be Secretary of Education after Ted Bell. And I said, well, how would you behave as Secretary of Education? He said, I will cut everything back and slow it down, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, would you abolish the department? And I said, well, I can only do that, he said, if that's what the president wants to do. But I promise you this, the spending on the Department of Education will not get any bigger, and we will cut back wherever we can. And that's a promise that I can make for you, and John Silber can't. And I said, okay, Bill, I'll assume you're as good as your word, and I'll rally other conservative leaders behind you. Well, one day I opened up the Washington Post, and there was a front-page story saying Secretary Bennett increases Education Department funding levels to record levels. And I called up Bennett, and I said, Bill, I thought you were a man of your word, but according to today's Washington Post, you're one of the boys. You're going to make the department bigger, more expensive, more intrusive. And he said, well, Howard, you have to understand this. Where you stand depends on where you sit. That's a direct quote. And you can't be taken seriously as the head of a cabinet department unless you advocate more funding for your department. And I said, Bill, I'm very disappointed. Click. And I lost all respect for Bill Bennett as a result of that,
right,
and some related things. But you're right. Your basic theme is absolutely correct.
And, you know, we had a quantum jump in leaving the conservative principles behind with Bush 2. Not that there's been any president that's been 100% good or anything close to it, but with George W. Bush, it was uncharted territory for a Republican, and in every field. So the problem is that, okay, to me, it's conclusive that conservatism has failed by what we set out to do domestically.
Well, the problem is we've placed our faith in people who are advertised to be conservative, who in effect are just political prostitutes, using that title as a way of gaining money and support.
One of Stan Evans' most famous quotes is that once one of our people has the opportunity in office to do something, there's no longer our people.
That's right.
And that's the history of it. In asking why this happened, I think one reason is partisanship. We became captive of the Republican Party. And
loyalty was not to the Constitution, but to the party.
Yeah. George Washington warned as much against factions, yeah, and the ungood influence of party, not meaning a political party, which we didn't have at that time, just the faction. And he warned as much against that as he did against foreign affairs interference. Yeah, and so we've paid the price on that. Almost all energy taken in trying to control the Republican Party, not being successful, and not on advancing the conservative principles.
And so as a result, people settle for the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
They'll say, well, it's worth it to get that inch, but it isn't.
But also
you surrender a yard to get the inch.
And it's to the stage now where both sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, have an automatic reflex against anyone on the other party, and cannot conceive of doing anything but voting for their side as the lesser of two evils.
You think the Tea Party movement will change any of this?
Well, that's one of the two things that give me some hope. One is the Ron Paul movement.
There aren't many great men on the political scene today, but Ron Paul qualifies.
Yes, and he's been the lone symbol of the Constitution in Congress for all these years, and now we have where he is in the polls against Obama, 42% to 41%. I mean, that's astounding. And I'm not sure they all know who Ron Paul is, but they know he's not Obama. But even so, he's come a long, long way.
Has he ever?
And so that's one thing that gives me hope. The second thing that gives me hope is the Tea Party movement, and I think it's still to be seen. But I like the independents there, the fact that most of them seem to be realize that and fighting the idea of being co-opted by the Republican Party.
It's a great encouragement. And I'm further encouraged by the vicious, unfounded, unfair attacks on the Tea Party movement by the establishment media.
That shows that they're having impact. And,
That's right.
And that the left is
Our
very
people
worried.
are always unfairly attacked
Yeah.
by groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a bunch of money-hungry bigots.
Well, you have to worry if you're doing your job if you're not attacked by them and other groups on the left, So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say, comparing the liberals and the conservatives, has been the biggest failure of the liberals?
Giving up all their original principles, and to me, they're
principles
almost
of classical liberalism.
Classical liberalism, yeah. And the principles the country was founded on, as far as the Constitution.
Isn't it amazing
limited powers
that private property is no longer celebrated or honored? And we need to explain. People say, "Well, you're calling Obama a socialist. He's not a socialist. He's a Democrat." You've got to remind people what socialism is. Socialism is theft. It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. We'll take his money to fund our project. We have to break now. We're going to have a couple of minutes for you at the end. Stay with us, and we'll hear some last words from David Franke.
Hi, I'm Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee's 7th Congressional District. Just as you hear every couple of years, this is an important election. And I think for those of us who are conservatives, this is indeed a very crucial election. Everything's on the ballot, and this is one of those years to show up and be counted and make your conservative voice heard. Whether it is reducing federal spending, reducing the size of the bureaucracy, or securing our border. These are issues that are of primary importance to us, and I hope that all of our conservatives are going to show up and vote to protect faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Roundtable, please check out our website, www.conservativeusa. If you'd like to receive free of charge some of our publications, including my own Howard Phillips issued strategy bulletin and our members' message, all you need to do is provide your name and address to our fax number, 703-281-4108, or drop us a note at 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, Virginia, 221 180. David Franke has been our guest, a leader of the conservative movement for half a century. He doesn't look that old, does he? David, we talked about the failure of liberalism, the failure of conservatism. Talk about the success of fascism.
Back in World War II, it was between the socialists and the communists. And the socialism morphed into fascism. There were different varieties from the very beginning. You had the Nazi variety in Germany, you had Mussolini's corporate state, and you had a different version in Franco's Spain. And so what happened was when Mussolini started his corporate state in Italy, he became the darling of liberal intellectuals here in the United States and abroad.
People forget that, don't they?
Oh, yes, and FDR, I can only describe it as love letters, FDR to Mussolini, and then back from Mussolini to FDR. Mussolini made the wrong step, though, of siding with Germany instead of England, and we know where FDR's first loyalties were. They were to England. And so after that,
and they hung Mussolini by his boots.
Right. So the thing is, after the war, the liberals went back to their admiration for fascism, minus Mussolini and minus the word. And what we have had is corporatism, fascism, which is the bringing together of government and business, meaning big business,
globalism,
which has become global business, yes. And that has been what has taken over the world, and that's why I call it the triumph of fascism. And once we understand that, then we realize what we are really up against is more than just the Democrats or something. And the Republicans promote certain aspects of fascism more, the Democrats other aspects. With Bush, it was deprivation of civil liberties, preemptive war, things of that sort. With Obama, it's taking over the corporations and businesses that he wants to take over, and nationalizing health care. And so I don't think of Obama as a socialist. I think of him as a fascist. And but I thought the same thing of George W. Bush. In fact, I would say you and I may be the last anti-fascist around.
David, thanks for a great show, and thank you for watching Conservative Roundtable.